I'm Paul.
I'm Mindy.
Paul and Mindy were searching for their dream home in 2018 when they heard about a Property Brothers casting call.
They had told us that they wanted us to be their first episode. We instantly started doing whatever steps we needed to do.
Mindy and Paul King stepped into their 2018 Property Brothers renovation expecting a masterpiece, but they allegedly found exposed gas lines and shoddy work instead. That 2021 lawsuit,
a local couple's appearance on a popular reality show, things aren't as rosy as they seem on TV. In this case, it's a home remodel on HGTV. But they couldn't get resolution on their living room. They turned to the courtroom.
still active in 2026, finally ripped the TV magic curtain aside. Between Jonathan Scott admitting to PopSugar that house hunts are often staged and the brothers navigating private family health crises, the gloss is fading. Let's look at these miracles and see if they actually hold up or if it's just clever editing. The birth of a real estate machine. Before the multi-million-dollar deals and the perfectly tailored suits, Jonathan and Drew Scott were just two brothers in Vancouver trying to figure out why their dreams kept hitting a brick wall. Most people don't realize they were actually born on June 28, 1978, into a world that had nothing to do with construction or property taxes. They were performers at heart, purely and simply. Jonathan was obsessed with magic, even performing under the stage name Room Service, while Drew was leaning hard into acting. But here's the thing that rarely makes it into the highlight reels. They were struggling. They were essentially failing at the very things they loved most. By the time they reached their early 20s, the starving artist lifestyle wasn't just a cliché, it was their reality. It was actually their father who eventually sat them down and gave them the advice that would change everything, suggesting they stop waiting for a phone call from an agent and start building something tangible. That's how, in 2003, they pivoted into real estate. But it wasn't some smooth transition into luxury listings. It was a grind. They started by buying a house near their university with a tiny down payment, doing the renovations themselves, and flipping it for a $50,000 profit. According to a retrospective interview on their own YouTube channel, that first taste of real estate blood was addictive. Suddenly, the magic tricks and the auditions took a backseat to the much more lucrative world of property flipping. They didn't just stumble into a TV deal after that first win. For years, they were the ones on the other end of the phone, making those soul-crushing cold calls to strangers trying to find distressed properties before anyone else did. Imagine cold calling homeowners all day, every day, just hoping for one person to say yes to a flip. Could you actually pull off that kind of rejection day after day without losing your mind? They did it because they had to, and it worked. They scaled up their business, Scott Real Estate Inc., into a legitimate operation. Yet, the itch for the spotlight never truly went away. Drew was still out there auditioning, and at one point, he actually got rejected from a show called Realtor Idol. It sounds ridiculous now, but that rejection was the very thing that led him to a production company looking for a pair of brothers who could host a renovation show. When the Property Brothers finally premiered in 2011, first on the W Network in Canada and then on HGTV, it felt like an overnight success, but it was really a decade in the making. The show was an instant hit because it promised something we hadn't seen: the total transformation of a dump into a dream home in record time. But even back then, in those early seasons, the seeds of the staging controversies were already being planted. To keep the production on schedule and the budgets predictable, the reality part of reality TV started to get a little blurry. According to insights from Nikki Swift, the production wasn't just documenting a house hunt. They were often selecting participants who had already decided on a house or were already well into the process. The growth after that was absolutely explosive. By the time we hit the 2020s, the Scott brothers had filmed over 300 episodes, launched dozens of spin-offs, and built an empire worth well over $100 million. They weren't just contractors anymore, they were a global brand. But as the empire grew, so did the pressure to deliver those high-stakes, high-speed miracles that HGTV viewers craved. It's exactly that pressure that began to warp the authenticity of their work. They were trapped in a cycle where the TV magic had to happen within a strict filming window, which meant the construction crews were often working around the clock under conditions that would make any normal contractor sweat. And here's where it gets interesting. While the world saw two smiling brothers in plaid shirts making everything look easy, the reality behind the cameras was becoming a high-pressure machine. They were no longer just flipping houses for themselves. They were managing a production schedule that demanded perfection on a deadline. That miracle you saw at the end of a 30-minute episode, it was the result of a massive unseen team and a lot of logistical gymnastics. Jonathan and Drew have since admitted that the house hunting portion of the show is often the most tweaked part of the process. In a 2016 interview with PopSugar, Jonathan actually confirmed that they don't have time to show the weeks of boring paperwork or the houses that fell through, so they streamline it for the camera. But as the staging became a standard part of the business model, the line between what was a necessary production shortcut and what was a genuine oversight started to thin. They were building a legacy on the idea that they were the ultimate problem solvers, the guys who could fix anything. But you have to wonder, when you're building an empire that fast, how long can you keep all those plates spinning before one of them finally shatters? The transition from raw, brotherly hustle to a polished corporate product was complete, and the stage was set for the world to see what happens when the real world finally catches up to the TV magic. The illusion of the hammer. Mindy and Paul King stepped into their newly renovated home in 2018, expecting the sparkling sanctuary they'd been promised on camera. But instead, they were allegedly greeted by the smell of gas and the sight of wires dangling where they definitely shouldn't be. It's the kind of moment that completely shatters the HGTV magic we've all grown to love. And it's exactly why the Kings filed a massive lawsuit in January 2021 that is still causing headaches for the brothers in 2026. This wasn't just a minor disagreement over paint colors. We're talking about claims of over 90 health and safety violations. But if you look closely at how the show is actually made, these cracks in the foundation didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were the inevitable result of a production machine that values the wow factor more than the boring reality of building codes. Here's the thing that Jonathan Scott actually admitted to himself. The hunt for the house is often a complete fabrication. Back in 2016, in a PopSugar interview, Jonathan came clean and explained that most people appearing on the show have already bought the house they're going to renovate before the cameras even start rolling. Think about your favorite reveal moment for a second. What if the client already knew exactly which house they were getting, and that entire dramatic choice between House A and House B was mostly just for us, the audience? It's a common industry practice, according to reporting by Entertainment. Now, because the show simply doesn't have the time to film a real, messy real estate search that could take months, they need to get straight to the sledgehammers to keep the episode on track. But the staging goes way deeper than just picking the house early. The editing room is where the real miracles happen, and sometimes those miracles come at the expense of the truth. There's a fascinating story highlighted by Nikki Swift about a participant whose daughter's bathroom was intentionally edited to look like a simple powder room during the reveal. Why? Because a full bathroom renovation is complicated and time-consuming, while a powder room wow moment is quick, punchy, and fits perfectly into a 30-minute time slot. They basically swapped the reality of the home's layout to satisfy the narrative of a quick and easy transformation. It makes you realize that what we see on screen isn't a documentary. It's a carefully constructed story where the house is just a prop. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and a little bit worrying. To make these renovations look like they happen overnight, the production crews are pushed to absolute extremes. Drew Scott has echoed this sentiment, explaining that while a real renovation might take 6 to 8 weeks, they have to compress that entire timeline into a fraction of the time for filming purposes. According to insiders cited by Yahoo News, this rushed timeline is the secret sauce that makes the show so addictive. But it's also the very thing that leads to shortcuts. When you have a filming crew, a lighting team, and a director all waiting for a room to be finished so they can get the reveal shot, the pressure to ignore a loose wire or a slightly off-center pipe becomes immense. It's an undeniable truth that the brothers have become more candid about these tricks as the years have gone by. But that honesty usually only surfaced after participants started speaking out. They've framed it as a necessity for the pace of television, which sounds reasonable enough until you're the one living in the house. Imagine paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for a renovation, only to find out that the completed look was just a facade for the cameras. There are reports that in some cases, the houses aren't even fully finished when the reveal happens. The furniture is staged, the lighting is dimmed to hide imperfections, and the happy homeowners are essentially acting out a script of surprise. The brothers themselves aren't necessarily the ones swinging the hammers on every single job anymore. They're the faces of a massive conglomerate. When you're filming multiple spin-offs and managing a $100 million empire, you're relying on local contractors who are being squeezed by HGTV's brutal production schedules. This creates a dangerous gap between the promise of a property brother masterpiece and the reality of a rushed construction job. Drew and Jonathan have admitted that they can't be everywhere at once. But for the families who signed up for the Scott treatment, that's a hard pill to swallow when the basement starts leaking or the electrical panel starts humming. And get this, the tension between TV speed and real-world safety is exactly what fuels the drama we see in the headlines today. It's one thing to stage a house hunt to save time. It's an entirely different thing to stage a completed renovation that hasn't actually passed inspection. The brothers' empire has endured because they are incredibly charismatic, and they've built a brand on trust. But as more participants come forward with stories of hidden flaws and rushed work, that trust is being tested like never before. They've pivoted to a more raw style of TV lately, perhaps as a way to get ahead of these criticisms, but the legacy of those early, highly staged years is still catching up to them. Think about that for a second. We've spent over a decade watching these miracles happen in 30 minutes, and we've been conditioned to believe that home renovation is a fast, fun, and mostly aesthetic process. But the Scott brothers' own admissions reveal a much more calculated reality. Every surprise discovery of mold or a structural issue is a beat in a script designed to keep us watching. It's a brilliant business model, absolutely, but it's also a house of cards that relies on nobody looking too closely behind the drywall once the cameras are packed away and the crew has moved on to the next dream home. The transition from these staging secrets to literal legal battles was almost inevitable. When you prioritize the magic of the reveal over the grit of the work, someone eventually gets hurt. And that brings us directly to the doorstep of the Kings, whose story isn't just a disgruntled customer complaint, but a full-blown legal nightmare. The dream that became a danger zone. Mindy and Paul King stood in their Las Vegas kitchen in 2018, surrounded by cameras and the beaming Scott brothers, staring at a transformation that looked absolutely flawless on a high-definition monitor. The episode aired as a triumph, another win for the Scott brothers' legacy, showing off a sparkling, modern aesthetic that seemingly justified every penny the Kings had poured into the project. But as soon as the production trucks packed up and the studio lights went dark, that masterpiece began to literally fall apart. According to the original reporting by House Beautiful, what was presented as a dream home was actually hiding a nightmare of exposed electrical wires, serious fire hazards, and dozens of code violations that made the space genuinely dangerous for the family to inhabit. It wasn't just a case of a picky homeowner or a few scuffed baseboards. The details of the lawsuit filed in Clark County, Nevada, on January 14, 2021, paint a picture of a construction site that was abandoned mid-chaos. The Kings sued Cineflix, the production company behind the show, along with Villa Construction, alleging they were defrauded by a system that prioritized the reveal over basic safety.
The Las Vegas family suing the production company behind the Property Brothers. Paul and Mindy King filed paperwork against production company Cineflix.
They claimed more than $100,000 in damages, citing things like improperly installed doors, a backsplash that was peeling off the wall, and, most terrifyingly, live wires left behind walls. According to local reporting from News 3 LV, the legal battle has been an absolute marathon, with a jury trial scheduled for October 2024 and the fallout still making waves well into 2026. Now, here's where it gets truly messy. While Drew and Jonathan Scott weren't initially named as individual defendants in the original suit, the Kings have openly discussed adding them to the litigation as the trial progresses. The brothers have built this impenetrable brand on being the ultimate experts, but this lawsuit exposes the massive gap between their TV personas and the actual subcontractors hired by the production companies. Villa Construction, the firm tasked with the literal heavy lifting, allegedly didn't even have the proper permits for some of the work. Think about that for a second. You're on one of the most famous home renovation shows in the world, and the people behind the scenes might be skipping the most basic legal requirements just to hit a filming deadline. Would you ever let a TV crew renovate your own home, knowing that the rush to get that wow shot might leave literal fire hazards behind your kitchen cabinets? It's a gamble that the Kings clearly regret. The lawsuit alleges that the production rush was the root cause of everything. In the world of reality TV, time is money isn't just a phrase, it's a law. If a shoot is scheduled for a Tuesday, that kitchen has to look finished by Tuesday morning, even if the grout isn't dry or the electrical isn't grounded. Entertainment Now has highlighted how this speed over safety culture is the dark underbelly of the HGTV era, where the aesthetics are meticulously managed while the structural integrity is treated as an afterthought. But the story doesn't end with a few leaky pipes. The Kings shared photos as part of their legal filings that are absolutely jarring compared to the glossy footage we saw on air. They showed crooked cabinets, uneven flooring, and gas lines that weren't properly secured. It's an undeniable truth that the brothers' charm and their magic couldn't fix these hazards. They can sell you on a lifestyle and a color palette, but they aren't the ones in the crawl space checking the wiring at 3 a.m. According to the files, the Kings felt completely abandoned by the experts once the entertainment value of their home had been squeezed dry for the episode. The legal status of the case in 2026 continues to be a cloud over the Scott empire, precisely because it challenges the fundamental promise of their brand. If the property brothers can't ensure a safe house, then what exactly are people buying into? The production company, Cineflix, has consistently denied the allegations, claiming the work was high quality and the Kings were simply looking for a payout. But the evidence of code violations is hard to ignore, especially when local building inspectors have to get involved to tell a family their dream kitchen is a fire trap. Here's the thing that gets really interesting. This lawsuit isn't just about one family in Vegas. It has become a landmark case for how reality TV treats homeowners. It forced a conversation about who is actually responsible when things go wrong. Is it the charismatic stars whose names are on the show? Or is it the invisible production company that actually holds the contracts? The Kings struggle to get accountability highlights just how layered and protected these celebrity empires are. They've had to fight for years just to get a day in court, all while the Scott brothers continued to launch new shows and sell furniture to millions of fans who have no idea about the live wires in that Vegas kitchen. As the trial moves forward, it's becoming clear that the Property Brothers machine might have grown too big for its own good. When you're trying to renovate hundreds of homes across multiple cities simultaneously for different spin-offs, the quality control is bound to snap somewhere. For the Kings, it snapped in the most dangerous way possible. They weren't just victims of bad luck, they were victims of a business model that views a house as a set first and a home second. And just when you think the pressure of these legal threats was enough to break the brothers, you realize that the cracks in their lives were happening on an even more personal level. Because while these lawsuits were hitting their business and their reputation, a series of family crises was quietly hitting their souls. Let's check it out. The cracks in the porcelain. J.D. Scott was filming a segment in 2019 when his body simply decided to stop cooperating. It wasn't just exhaustion from a busy production schedule, it was a total system failure that left the third brother of the Scott empire fearing for his life. For months, the man who helped build the behind-the-scenes world of Property Brothers was spiraling into a terrifying mystery of extreme pain, sensitivity to heat, and a fog of depression that felt inescapable. According to his own heartbreaking account in the 2021 documentary J.D. Scott, The Unexpected Journey, there were moments when he genuinely believed he was dying. And get this, the culprit wasn't a freak accident or a rare tropical disease, but a reaction to common antibiotics. He was eventually diagnosed with fluoroquinolone toxicity, a condition where the side effects of certain antibiotics essentially poison the body's connective tissues and nervous system. Imagine being at the height of your family's global fame, surrounded by cameras and dream home reveals, while your own body feels like it's being dismantled from the inside out. JD became so sensitive that even the smallest bit of heat would make him feel like his skin was crawling, and the physical toll quickly turned into a mental one. But because the Scott machine never stops, Drew and Jonathan had to find a way to keep the cameras rolling while simultaneously acting as the primary support system for their brother. But the family's health trials didn't stop with JD. Just as he was beginning the long road to recovery, Drew's wife, Linda Fan, began her own silent battle. In 2020, while the world was already upside down, Linda was diagnosed with Graves' disease, an immune system disorder that results in the overproduction of thyroid hormones. According to a timeline detailed by The List, this diagnosis hit right as the couple was trying to start a family. What followed was a grueling 2-year journey through the emotional ringer of fertility treatments, including 2 failed rounds of IVF that left them both devastated. Think about that for a second. How do you keep working, smiling for the reveal shots, and cracking jokes for HGTV when your family's health is hanging by a literal thread? It's a level of pressure that most of us can't even begin to wrap our heads around. The Property Brothers brand is built on the idea that these guys can solve any problem with a sledgehammer and a floor plan. But here they were, facing issues that no amount of money or fame could fix. It turns out that behind the million-dollar smiles and the perfectly coiffed hair, the grind was breaking their bodies and their spirits. Drew actually started stepping back from the screen during this time, a move that didn't go unnoticed by longtime fans. While he was still a core part of the shows, his screen time began to drop as he prioritized being home for Linda's treatments and JD's recovery. It was a rare moment where the human cost of the empire became visible to the public. According to reporting from Realtor.com, the shows during this period took on a noticeably different emotional tone. They were less about the quick flip and more about the emotional connection, likely a reflection of the reality that the brothers were living behind the scenes. There is an uncomfortable truth here that we rarely talk about when it comes to celebrity culture. We see the success, the $100 million net worth, and the shiny TV shows, but we don't see the hormones, the antibiotics, and the stress that turn these stars into vulnerable humans. The Scott brothers were navigating a world where their private agony was constantly being amplified by their public fame. Every time they showed up to a set, they had to leave the hospital visits and the failed IVF results at the door. JD's unexpected journey wasn't just his own. It was a shared trauma for a family that had spent decades trying to appear invincible. And yet, it's exactly this period of suffering that seems to have forged a new path for them. Jonathan and Drew have both admitted that these health crises forced them to reevaluate what they were building. The focus shifted from just scaling the brand to survival and genuine well-being. They were no longer just the guys who fix houses. They were a family that had been through the fire and came out the other side with a lot of scars. It's a far cry from the perfectly staged house hunts of their early years, isn't it? The transition from being the miracle workers of television to being people who deal with chronic pain and fertility struggles is a massive evolution. It stripped away the polish and showed the world that even the biggest empires have cracks in the porcelain. But as they began to heal, they didn't just go back to the old way of doing things. They took those lessons and started to pivot their entire production style. They realized that the audience was starting to crave the very thing they had been hiding, the messy, unpolished, and sometimes painful reality of life. This scarred evolution led them to their most recent move, a shift that many didn't see coming: the price of authenticity. The Scott brothers were standing in the middle of a literal disaster zone in Los Angeles, surrounded by the charred remains of homes destroyed by wildfires, when they realized the old TV formula just didn't work anymore. It was October 2025, and while their empire was technically stronger than ever, the shadow of the King lawsuit was still looming large, casting a doubt over every perfect reveal they had ever filmed. They needed something more than just another renovation show. They needed a way to prove that they could still be trusted. That's why they greenlit Property Brothers, Under Pressure, a docuseries that HGTV premiered in early 2026, promising a version of the brothers we've never actually seen before. According to a reveal in People magazine, this new project was designed to be raw, stepping away from the glossy editing and staged house hunts that had defined their careers for over a decade. But let's be real for a second. A pivot toward authenticity often feels like a calculated response to being exposed. When you've spent years admitting that the house hunts were pre-picked and that the reveals were edited for a wow factor, the only way to stay relevant is to lean into the messiness you once hid. In this new series, Jonathan is shown navigating the high-stakes rebuild of his own home with Zooey Deschanel, dealing with the kind of real-world delays and permit nightmares that the show used to edit out. It's a fascinating shift, and it makes you wonder, does this new, raw style actually redeem the staged past, or is it just too little, too late? According to industry analysis from Deadline, the network is betting big on this evolution, hoping that viewers will embrace the brothers as vulnerable humans rather than just infallible TV gods.
The brothers, who reign over one of HGTV's most popular franchises, were once down and out, as they tell People magazine in the September 4th issue. Drew racked up $100,000 in debt pursuing an acting career.
Even with this fresh start, the legal reality of the past hasn't just vanished. The $100 million empire is still navigating the fallout of those speed over safety claims from 2018. The lawsuit from Mindy and Paul King serves as a permanent reminder that in the world of construction, you can't just edit out a fire hazard. By admitting that the past polish might have hidden too much, the brothers are essentially performing a public audit of their own brand. It's an undeniable truth that their adaptability is their greatest strength. They saw the cracks in the porcelain and decided to show them to us before we could find them ourselves. But after everything they've been through, the lawsuits, the toxicity scares with JD, and the personal battles with fertility, the brothers seem to have realized that perfection was always an illusion. Resilience, on the other hand, is very real. They are capping this chapter of their story with a mix of hope and tension, trying to bridge the gap between who they were and who they need to be to survive the next decade of television. As the 2026 season unfolds, the world is watching to see if the Scott brothers can truly thrive in a world where the cameras aren't just looking for the beauty, but for the truth beneath the drywall. The glossy facade of the Scott empire finally cracked, revealing a reality of staged hunts, dangerous lawsuits, and private health battles. Knowing what really happened, does this raw 2026 pivot actually redeem them? Or did the staging ruin the magic for you?